Greetings and welcome. Now, before we get into the journey of the genre, let's describe the characteristics that the genre has. It's a style of extreme metal, which typically has down-tuned guitars and tremolo pick riffs, along with palm muting, chromatic chord progressions. Drums range from double kick to various types of blast beats and sometimes D beats. Vocals are at most times growled, ranging from mid to low growls and the occasional high scream, which varies depending on the approach of the band or vocalist. Death metal also has tons of unexpected tempo changes, which can sometimes or more often seem spontaneous. The style of music originated as part of the underground scene in the 1980s. Early bands took heavy inspiration from the thrash metal scene, which included bands such as Creator, Sodom, Slayer, Volcano, Sarcophago, Sepultura, Horror and Reincarnation. The early death metal records did not sound as death metal does today. Many in the early days still had a heavy thrash metal influence, played more aggressively though. The shift or evolution was bound to happen as themes of horror and the occult were becoming more relevant in metal by the mid 80s. It was just the transposition musically that had to take place. With that being said, let's journey through the birth and evolution of the extreme genre known as death metal. The year is 1983. We are in San Francisco, which gave birth to a band called Possessed. While originally actually being part of the Bay Area thrash metal scene, Possessed had something which other thrash metal bands at this time didn't have. They played a bit more aggressive and just had an overall more evil sound to them. Also, the vocalist, Jeff Becerra, had a more horrific, guttural vocal style. These aspects had a huge influence on the formation of death metal. In 1984, they released a 3-track demo. The demo, which was titled Death Metal, along with the title track, which has coined the genre's name. The following year, they released Seven Churches, and it became more evident that it wasn't your typical thrash metal with slightly darker lyrics relating to Satanism, occultism, and anti Christianity. Was a crucial shift and influence for early death metal. Is Possessed the first real death metal band? Some say they belong in thrash metal, but like black metal, which also got inspired from thrash metal, the same can be said for death metal. There are those that call Possessed a hybrid between death and thrash, which brings us to the conclusion that Possessed could possibly be the first real death metal band in essence, or they could just be seen as proto death metal. It is subjective, not to mention having coined the genre's name, death metal. Necrophagia or necrophagia or necrophagia, depending on how you want to pronounce it, formed in 1983 as well. They became quite popular in the underground scene. 5 demos released, and in 1987 they released their debut full-length titled Season of the Dead. It was recorded and released the same year. There was another record which was recorded the year prior to this, but it wasn't released as the band split up. This album was called Ready for Death, which was bootlegged in the tape trading scene during 1990. Season of the Dead has definitely helped shape the sound, and with that, we can say that necrophagia are as important as Possessed was. Over in Florida, a band came into existence close to the time that Possessed and Necrophagia were formed. This band, founded by Chuck Schuldiner, was called Mantis. In 1984, they recorded several rehearsal tapes with a demo titled Death by Metal. The same year, they changed their name to Death. These releases all circulated in the underground tape trading scene, a slightly more extreme version of Possessed at the time, with roots in thrash metal. Chuck's vocals were much more aggressive on the demo than the vocals of Jeff from Possessed, which could mark the shift in vocal style in the shaping of death metal. In 1987, they released their debut full length Scream Bloody Gore, which to many is seen as the birth of death metal, along with Seven Churches by Possessed, as well as Season of the Dead by Necrophagia. And I could include Morbid Visions by Sepultura. Before we move on, a side note to a few bands along with the releases that have inspired the genre and could be seen as proto death metal or actual death metal in some cases. Welcome to Hell by Venom, Morbid Tales by Celtic Frost, Sacralegio by Parabegium, Hell Awaits by Slayer, Pleasure to Kill by Creator, Bloody Vengeance by Volcano, Bestial Death by Poison, Death is Fun by Necrophagia, Speed Kills by Thanatos, Grave Desecration by Mutilator, and the 1985 demo by Master, Strappado by Slaughter, Extreme Cold Weather by Messiah, Legion of Death with the self-titled Legion of Death. Most of these albums mentioned here can be easily classified as death metal or proto-death metal, depending on how you look at it. But regardless of that, these all had some form of inspiration on death metal. It is 1988 and Leprosy by Death is released, and death metal is really starting to take shape. Also at this time, a scene in Tampa, Florida and other parts of the USA was starting to become a bit more active. This era saw the rise of bands like Morbid Angel, who originally started their journey in 1983 under the name Ice. They had their first show at a high school talent show. They then played improvised versions of songs by Judas Priest and Scorpions. Later, they covered songs by Merciful Fate and Slayer. Soon, they changed the name to Heretic, which also got tossed as another band emerged with the same name. They finally settled on Morbid Angel in 1984. 4 demos released, and it was with the 4th demo, Thy Kingdom Come, where the band's sound was starting to actually take shape, and they became a force to be reckoned with. Even more aggression and a real occult band, whereas those before were more imagery and themes. Morbid Angel had real occultism in their music. You can sense and feel the magic. With that being said, onto an interview by Death Cheese Zine with guitarist and mastermind Trey, where he stated the following: "The only real motive for our band is for people to do what thou wilt," he said. "For people to think and not lump in with everybody else. Make your own decisions and don't do things because they're cool. Do things because you honestly like them, not just because you want to fit in. Be your own master." These were the words by Trey. Onto the debut in 1989 called Altars of Madness and Blessed Are the Sick in 91. With these releases, they became one of the most influential bands in the genre. You can even add Covenant in there, released in 93. You have the essential Morbid Angel. Spawned in 1984, Executioner, who played thrash metal with death metal influences. They released 4 demos, a split release. They decided to change their name to Obituary in 1988, and the following year released their debut called Slowly We Rot, and Cause of Death released in 1990. With this, they became another fundamental piece in the history of death metal. Another act from this scene would be Deicide from Tampa, Florida. They came onto the scene in 1987 as Carnage, who then changed their name to Amon. In 1989, they decided to rename the band to Deicide. The following year, they released their mighty self-titled debut. In 91, released the sophomore titled Legion. These two releases were in fact also important in the formation of the scene at the time. Glenn Benton's hatred for Christianity is all present in the lyrics. Legion became an essential in death metal, but personally, I believe the self-titled debut to be the superior release. There's just something about classics such as Lunatic of God's Creation and Carnage in the Temple of the Damned that always gets me. Maybe being the fact that it was the first death metal record I heard, so it's personal, but all in all, both Legion and Deicide self-titled are essential. More bands from the Florida death metal scene who helped in the shaping of the genre are acts such as Atheist, who added a slightly more progressive element to their style of death metal. They were previously known as Ravish. At that time, they had more of a thrash death hybrid style. Ravage was an acronym meaning Raging Atheist, Vowing a Gory End. In 87, they changed the name to Atheist. They released their debut in 89 called Piece of Time and Unquestionable Presence, also elements. These are very important in progressive death metal, along with Human by Death, released in 91. Pestilence and Cynic also adopted this progressive style of death metal. The subgenre can possibly be characterized as having a jazz influence in the compositions. It's also spontaneous, I'd say. The ones who fit in this category would be early Opeth, Edge of Sanity, Dark Millennium, etc. Nocturnus, who played a technical style of death metal. Sometimes there's an overlap between technical and progressive death metal. Nonetheless, I will try and define technical death metal. The use of diminished chords along with arpeggios often has odd time signatures or dynamic chord progressions, an abundant use of string skipping on the guitars. Bass lines are a bit more complex than that of the other genres in death metal. Drums feature many extreme techniques. The genre could be considered as having taken influence from jazz fusion and even free jazz, obviously thrash metal and other progressive metal and rock genres. Also a mention to a few more bands from USA, part of the ever-growing scene in the early days. Incubus with Serpent Temptation and Beyond the Unknown, Monstrosity with Imperial Doom, Massacre from Beyond. In New York, there was another scene brewing. Immolation released Dawn of Possession in 91, Baphomet with The Dead Shall Inherit. Suffocation, who are probably the first brutal death metal band, a subgenre which utilized triggered blast beats, a more chunky style of fast riffs and slam riffs. Another pioneer in brutal death metal would be Broken Hope from Chicago, Illinois. A few examples of bands who play brutal death metal: early Cannibal Corpse, Disgorge, Autopsy, Exhumed, Dying Fetus, Nile, and Internal Bleeding, who are also cited for inventing slam death metal. Now, slam death metal is known for its slow, chromatic breakdown riffs. Another scene in New Jersey with Incantation, who have also been a huge inspiration in death metal. They released Onward to Golgotha in 1992. There was also another death metal scene in Stockholm, Sweden, which emerged. Initially, what made most of these bands from Stockholm unique was the use of the buzzsaw guitar tone of the Boss HM2 pedal. The first possible death metal band from this region could most likely be a band who were originally called Scapegoat, formed in 1985, changing their name the following year to Morbid. They were, however, seen as a hybrid between death, thrash, and black metal. However, I would consider them to be the first Swedish death metal band, or at least have an influence in the genre. The 1987 demo, which featured Dead on vocals, would later move to Norway and join Mayhem. It featured the track My Dark Subconscious, which is now a classic, having influenced both death and black metal. Morbid are truly inspirational and essential, although having been short lived. Before we move on, a notable mention to Merciless. Although I see them as more of a proto death metal band who mainly focused on thrash metal, they have influenced the early shaping of the genre. They were also the first band to sign to Euronymous' owned label called Death Like Silence, where they released their debut in 1990 called The Awakening. Rising from the ashes of short-lived band Nihilist, along with a new bassist, comes Entombed. In 1990, they released Left Hand Path. To this day, still a very inspiring album to many, a truly crushing experience. Every single riff, every hook is enjoyable on this album and deserves the praise, and in fact is definitely an essential release for early death metal. They achieved their signature and inspiring bass or guitar tone by tuning down to B standard, which was played through a Boss HM2 pedal with all controls set to max. Apparently, the reason for them calling it buzzsaw was due to the fact that the tone kind of resembled a swarm of bees. More from Stockholm, Sweden. This member released Like an Ever-Flowing Stream in 1991. The same year, Grave with Into the Grave also unleashed with their debut full-length Where No Life Dwells. Other bands which belonged and influenced the scene were Unanimated, early Necrophobic, early Therion, notably the debut titled Of Darkness. After this, they slowly started becoming something other than death metal. Although there were traces of it on the second and third, they had influences of doom and more melody as well as classical metal influences until eventually transforming into a more symphonic operatic style of metal. Bands from other areas in Sweden which were influential as well include Edge of Sanity, Hypocrisy, and Eucharist. Another important scene in Sweden was the scene which was brewing in Gothenburg in the late 80s through to the early 90s. I would start with possibly the first death metal band from Gothenburg, Grotesque, which formed in 1988. Also Liars in Wait, which included the two guitarists of Grotesque, formed in 1990. Both of these were short-lived bands, with the former having 3 demos and an EP, the latter only releasing 1 EP, then soon split up. In 1990, At the Gates is formed, featuring vocalist of then dissolved band Grotesque, credited as the band who started melodic death metal or the Gothenburg sound. The new wave of British heavy metal influence, which included dual harmonic guitars, which was not present in other death metal at this time. At the Gates released the Gardens in Grief demo 91, which was essentially still pure death metal. It wasn't until the debut full length the following year where we see At the Gates start to shift into what would become the Gothenburg sound. They even used a violin in this album, which was still really uncommon in extreme metal during this era, and had influences from folk music, which would also be adapted by the other two pioneers in the Gothenburg scene, which will be mentioned soon. At the Gates gravitated towards a completely melodic death metal sound with each album until the release of Terminal Spirit Disease, where they truly landed, and then in 1995 they released what many call the essential At the Gates album, Slaughter of the Soul. Septic Broiler, formed in 1989, released 2 demos. They played a more traditional style of death metal. It wasn't long until they changed their name to Dark Tranquility in 91. 93, they released their debut full length, Sky Dancer, and 95, The Gallery. With these two releases, they set themselves as one of the pioneering bands, along with At the Gates and In Flames, who were formed in 1990. They released their debut, Lunar Strain, in 94, while still having touches of the Gothenburg sound on here. It wasn't until the 95 EP Subterranean and 96 full-length The Jester Race where In Flames became even more melodic. Out of the bands from Gothenburg, In Flames were probably the one who had the most use of twin guitar harmonies inspired by new wave of British heavy metal, particularly Iron Maiden. And because of the accessibility they had in their music, they became commercially successful, and as mentioned, are one of the pioneers despite transforming into something else, like many bands from this scene actually. But that's besides the point. The fact is that their early albums were very influential in shaping the Gothenburg scene. Other worthy mentions from this scene would be Sacramentum with their debut full-length Far Away from the Sun. Although this band is somehow seen as a hybrid between melodic death metal and melodic black metal, the same can be said with Dissection, although their final album Rain Chaos can be considered as the real melodic death metal album. They had traces of the genre in their early work, The Somberlane and Storm of the Lightsbane. Sacrilege too with Lost in the Beauty You Slay. More examples from other parts of Sweden would be Gates of Ishtar, God Gory, Arch Enemy, Soilwork, and many more. These are just a few examples. Finland also had a huge influence in melodic death metal. Bands such as Amorphous, with their second full length from 94, Tales from the Thousand Lakes, Sentence 2 with their second album from 93, North from Here. While we're in Finland and we on the topic, besides the melodic bands, there was something else happening in Finland when it came to death metal. The rise of bands who played off-kilter rhythms along with some doom metal characteristics. Demolich, formed in 1990, released 4 demos before their debut full length in 93. While only having this one album, it is truly a piece in an avant-garde death metal sphere. Another band from this scene would be Demigod and Adramalech. These bands, along with many others, helped shape Finnish death metal. Death doom metal is another genre which emerged. These bands that played this style, death doom metal, kind of took the opposite direction than most death metal in terms of speed, where playing as fast as possible and having compositions filled with riffs was replaced with slower dynamics, atmospheric riffs, or more common, slower, doomy riffs inspired by Trouble and Saint Vitus. Autopsy are one of the bands who actually alternated between blast beats and many doomy breaks for a somewhat gloomy feel. Then there are those who kind of define the genre with almost crawling pace and atmospheric lead guitar with a rhythm style down-tuned and distorted, which still retains an old school death metal feel. Double kick drumming, some used an alternation between harsh and clean vocals. Perfect examples of this style would be Disembowelment, Asphyx, early Paradise Lost, and Catatonia, along with Tiamat, who would later transform into gothic metal. Another style which is closely related to death doom was funeral doom, but that will be discussed at a later stage when we will take the journey through doom metal. There are many fusion genres like death doom metal. I'll mention a few of the fusion genres and their characteristics. First is blackened death metal, which incorporates some musical and also lyrical ideologies of black metal, as well as chord progressions similar to that of black metal, while still retaining the down-tuned guitars, growls, and instantaneous changes which are common in death metal. Examples of this style would be Angel Corpse, early Necrophobic, Belphegor, mid-era Behemoth, and Balzer, Death Grind, and Gore Grind, which fused the speed and intensity of grindcore along with the complexity of death metal. Lyrically, themes focused on gore, forensic, pathology, etc. Examples here would be Terrorizer, Brutal Truth, Exhumed, Mid-Era Napalm Death, Cattle Decapitation, and Phobia. Industrial death metal added elements of industrial music. An example would be Fear Factory. Symphonic death metal adds elements of classical music, typically orchestral and at times choirs. Examples would be Septic Flesh and Flesh God Apocalypse. Death and Roll uses death metal growls and highly distorted guitar riffs along with elements of 70s rock and metal. Examples would be Mid-Era Entombed and Death Breath. Deathcore, which is a fusion between death metal and metalcore, mostly focused on breakdowns and blast beats, shifting between growls and higher pitched screams, often the use of just simple power chords, open strings, and palm muting. There are also bands who incorporated a more melodic style. Examples of deathcore would be Despised Icon, All Shall Perish, Suicide Silence, and Carnifex. So let's continue with dissonant death metal. What is it? Some relate it to technical death metal. What dissonant death metal has is dissonant riffs. Atonal, angular, and chugging riffs are present too. Various lead guitar styles, pinch harmonics, squealing, dive bombs, and scratchy leads, all which create a dense dissonant wall of sound. Unconventional song structures and uncommon time signatures. Drumming is usually in off-kilter rhythms similar to that of Demilich from Finland, which brings us to the fact that Demilich could be considered as dissonant death metal. Also putting Immolation here, as these two bands did incorporate the off-kilter drumming as aforementioned, complex song structures. Also as early as Death with the release of Human, as this was where they became more progressive and technical. Probably the reason why Death is so highly regarded as the fathers of death metal, as so many have spawned from this old school death metal, prog and technical death metal, even dissonant death metal, along with Immolation and Demilich, all had an inspiration on the genre. But it wasn't until 1998 where I'd say dissonant death metal truly got defined. Gorguts from Canada releases their third full-length Obscura. Here they adopted discordant guitar harmonies, atonal riffs, unique and unpredictable drum patterns, unconventional time signatures, enough feedback to build that wall of sound. They kind of wrote the blueprint for dissonant death metal with this record. Many bands adopted this style, with some adding even more to the subgenre. Portal from Australia create cacophonous atmospheres with their discordant riffs, which projects a very disturbing and suffocating dense atmosphere. Alterate use dissonant textures with atmospheric sludge metal. Imperial Triumphant added avant-garde jazz to their mix of dissonant death metal. Ad Nauseam has heavy use of polyrhythms, creating atmospheric passages and intricate compositions. A few more examples of dissonant death metal would be Artificial Brain, Auroch, Antiversum, Light Dweller, Suffering Hour, Alterage, Impetuous Ritual, Mitochondrion, Abyssal, Convulsing, and Phobocosm. And with that, we have reached the conclusion of the journey through death metal.